And I'm going to say hello again to anyone who is watching this recording. This will be a quick lecture on line and shape. We're starting in to the elements of design, leaving the principles behind. Not really, but you know what I mean. And it is the 4th of July. So I am going to share my screen with you and get started. There are PDFs on this week's module if you want to use those as study guides or anything like that, or you want to have it open on your computer and just go along with me. Usually, when I taught high school, we always taught the elements first and the principles second, because the principles often assume that you had an idea about what made up the elements of art. But this book does it the opposite, and I've come to enjoy it because you learn how to put a design together, and then in this section you learn how to break it down and really talk about it in technical terms. So Paul Klee, who is an artist, once said that a line is a point that is set in motion, and that kind of stuck in the art and design world. There's 3 parts to every form. There's a point at which it stops or starts. There's no dimensions, no height, and no width with that. You know, hold on just one second. I noticed that in the recording, this was in the way. So I'm just going to do away with that. So the first part is the point, and the second part is the line. So once you put a point in motion, you get a line, and it can be an infinite. There are infinite ways to draw a line or to create a line. And then lines form shapes by enclosing them or outlining them, and those give you contours. So 3 parts of a form are point, line, and contour. In this photograph, you really have a great sense of line as it is created by light. So here we have Pablo Picasso drawing with a flashlight and capturing it in a photograph. Pretty cool. I'm not sure how they did this. I've looked at this actually for a long time, kind of wondering, wait a minute, if his arm was moving, why isn't there any sense of motion? But I'll have to do some research on it and figure out how they did it. But you can do this yourself at night. It's kind of fun, and people do it all the time. I've seen it on Instagram where they'll set their, on a really dark night, they'll set their camera lens open, and then with a flashlight you can make different motions. You can spell out things, all kinds of stuff. So here we have a line at the most basic level, and it is describing the edges of a shape, which is a center. But it's also a record here in this example of the path of Pablo Picasso's hand in space. Lines can do convey mood and feeling, and they're used extensively by artists to do that. So when you create a line, you're creating some kind of movement, and as we said, you can have a lot of variety in that. Our eye tends to follow lines, and we've talked about this in previous lectures. And there are lots of ways that you can describe lines. Lines can be nervous, excited, they can be calm. So keep this in mind as we move towards critiquing each other's work more, because you can talk about things like line and shape inside the compositions that people are creating. Oops, let's go back to there. These 2 examples are both made up of primarily of line, and they're very different. They have very different moods. The one on the top is sort of has this energetic, scattered feeling to it. And the one down below is, I love this one. It's really humorous, just sort of illustrating how adults talk, and how children speak and think. The artist caught that very, very well, I thought. So let me skip through all this again. Sorry. When I go backwards, I have to go through all of these little bits. I hear people coming in, so whoever's joining, it's so nice to have you. Okay, lots of different ways to describe line, lots of different ways to create line. When lines meet, they become shapes. And shapes are very closely related to form, but most of the time, shapes describe something that's two-dimensional, and form describes something that is three-dimensional. And also, form has a lot of other meaning in art, so it's best, if you want to be clear, that you're talking about a shape, that you use the word shape. And here we have just a very simple contour drawing of leaves. You can also use line and contour lines to describe form. So form is more three-dimensional. And here we see a couple of examples from nature. We see the horizontal lines on the sandstone or whatever that is in that canyon, and the lines that go around this aspen, or sorry, it's not an aspen, it's a birch tree. And those tend to, we're really familiar with that, and they tend to describe form and something that is three-dimensional, something that has volume. Some of the ways that you can create line, you can, dot them, break them up, do combinations of weight and all sorts of things. If you just do a series of dots, we as humans tend to interpret that as a line. Our eyes will follow the dots and it becomes an implied line. And then when we have something pointing at one another, we have two things pointing at one another, that we tend to connect those as well in what is known as a psychic line. The different types of line, again, are the actual line itself, or an implied line, or a psychic line. So as you're looking around, when you leave here today and go about your day, and especially if you're looking at art or advertisements, just try to see those three different types of line. So sometimes when you are analyzing a piece of art, you can do what this example shows us, where they show the line, how the lines in this painting are directing the viewer around the painting. So it goes into a lot more detail in the book, but there are implied lines between the curve of the man's hand on his hip and the fortune teller's hand. There's definitely psychic lines between his eyes and the fortune teller's eyes, but also between the other ladies in the background, their eyes and his head. So lots of psychic lines going on there. And then there's another line, a curved line, that follows the curve of the pickpocket's arm down to her hand, relieving this gentleman of his valuables, and the curve of his shirt back up again to the fortune teller's hand. So all these things seem, very spontaneous. You might not even think about it when you first look at a painting like this, but then once you start to analyze it, you really can see what the artist did. line can go in different directions, and the different directions that you place your line in your composition are going to convey different types of moods. So when you see horizontal lines, and just think of maybe a sunset over the ocean, there's a lot of horizontal line activity there with the line of the sand, the line of the waves, and the line of the horizon. That most of the time implies quiet and repose. When you have a lot of vertical lines, like imagine a cityscape, you get more of a feeling of strength and stability. And sometimes you get action potential out of that. But if you want to convey movement, then you use diagonal lines. Diagonal lines put something or seem to convey the feeling of being slightly off balance, and they carry that feeling of something is about to happen. This is going somewhere. Something is going to move. Sometimes the format of your composition will affect the choice of line and direction. For an example, most paintings are rectangular, and there are several examples in the book which show you how horizontal and vertical lines within a design stabilize any elements that might be giving a feeling of movement or things that are off balance. And those examples are around page 134 and on. One of them is this painting of a couple of boxers. And you can see there's a lot of diagonal lines here where the action is, where the focal point is. But it's also, everything is kind of contained within these vertical and horizontal lines of the ring itself. So this is a way that they're used together. So the horizontal lines lend this kind of chaotic scene inside the ring more of a feeling of stability. It's contained. There are different types of line. If you've taken a drawing class, no doubt you've done contour and gesture drawings. Some people might think of them as one is more precise and the other is more spontaneous, but they can be either or. A contour line is often used to define the outside of the form. It can be very loose, as in the bottom portion of this drawing, where it's very light. There's just a few lines on each article of clothing and on the young girl describing that element. And then without changing technique, the hair and the face of the woman is much more refined. It's more filled in. There's more value changes going on. So even though this is a contour drawing top to bottom, you can see that you can use it in different ways. Gesture drawing is often used to describe motion or movement, and it's more describing the shape or an action. So here you see a little bit of both in this drawing of Christ carrying the cross by Rembrandt. And you've got some really squiggly, loose lines that indicate action or movement. And then you have a few more carefully drawn elements like Jesus's face that are also done in a gesture and contour style. So both can be combined in any drawing. There's almost an infinite variety of line quality. So when you are looking at art or when you are creating your own, just think about, take a pencil and a piece of paper and see how many different ways you can draw a line. You can vary the volume. You can vary the quality of the line. And here's an example of a painting that really isn't representational of anything, but it has a lot of mood or a lot of feeling in it. Might bring to mind different things for different people. For me, it seems kind of musical, but it's just using a lot of different types of line and a little bit of color. Again, just like whether your lines are horizontal or vertical or diagonal, the type of line that you choose to use can help convey a certain mood or emotion. Artists know how to create value with line, and they started doing this a long time ago, but it became really prevalent. We're used to seeing it all the time in comics, because oftentimes comics, especially in newspapers, are limited to just black and white. They're often quick line drawings. And in order to get some depth and volume, artists will use hatching or cross-hatching. So on the right of this one, you'll see just straight line or a little bit curved, but basically lines that are parallel to one another. And as they get closer and closer together, they create a darker, more dense area. And as they get farther apart, it's more airy. You can also see on his shadow that there are areas where there's cross-hatching. So cross-hatching is simply parallel lines that are crossed by parallel lines in the opposite direction. And you can see a little bit of that in this Rembrandt. He uses a lot of different types of hatching and cross-hatching to get all the different values in this drawing. You can get a very three-dimensional quality out of that. And this just shows you that line and value are not limited to paper and two-dimensional objects or compositions. This one is a textile that uses line, uses string and stitches to create pattern and texture. In painting, you'll see line. You'll see a lot more than line. You'll see edges that are defined by color changes, but that always gives you an implied line. So you may see actual forms that are outlined, or you may see implied lines and when shapes change from one to another. So the type of line can affect the impression of the overall image. And this one we have kind of thin lines that just help delineate the paintings and the edges, the silhouette of the artist. In this Lichtenstein, oops. So just remember that whatever you want to depict, you can adapt your line to that. Here's the Lichtenstein, very, what's the right word? Distinctive style he had, sort of a comic book style with heavy, thick lines, called an explicit line. There's an emphasis on edges in this type of work. And then you can have lines that are actually created by something other than a pen or a pencil, but they're still interpreted by our brain as lines. So here we have brush strokes. There's no object really here, but there's definitely a feeling of dimension, dimensionality, thanks to the value changes in these brush strokes and the way they overlap. There's something done quite a bit in painting called lost and found contour. And this Caravaggio painting is a great example of that. If you have the book, you can see the line drawing where they captured a little bit of what's happening here. And you really only just see the edges of faces. So you don't see entire contours. It's like the line has not been completed, but you see enough that you know what the shape is and you understand what's happening. But it also helps to convey the light, very dramatic lighting in this. Then we have inherent line and the structure of the rectangle. So in any rectangular composition, there are just inherent lines. So you could see that if you just took a piece of paper and folded it in half and then fold it in half diagonally and fold it in half diagonally again, and then unfolded it, you would see all these different lines. Sometimes those can be very useful in a piece of art in drawing the eye around. And this is a good example of how some of those inherent lines inside of the rectangle of the canvas has been utilized. And there's a whole in-depth analysis of this painting in your book. I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute and see if anyone has any questions or comments on line, how you've noticed line, how you've tried to use it maybe in some of your work so far or not. Just anything. Okay, I don't think anyone has anything. So we'll keep going. I'm going to share my screen again. And we're going to move on to shape. So we talked about it earlier in the last chapter that when lines are closed, and they don't even have to be fully enclosed, but lines form shapes. Shapes have volume, or they appear to have volume. The definition that we use is a visually perceived area created by an enclosing line or by color or value changes that define an outer edge. Shape can also be used to call form, but shape is more specific. We have a really simple drawing, painting of apples. There's a great discussion of these two photographs in your book, and they talk about figure and ground, how figure and ground are established in a painting or in photography. And if we go back one, this one's really simple. The apples are the figures and the ground is the background. But when we move to these photographs, especially the one on the left, the figure and the ground become a little more ambiguous. You can look at it, and as you look at the one on the left, your eye shifts back and forth. Sometimes you see the black shape as being the foreground or the figure, and sometimes the white shapes come forward and become the figure. But generally speaking, the figure is the foreground element and the ground is the volume or the space around the figures or the forms. Two-dimensional design, as in painting or drawing or Photoshop, photography, is basically the arrangements of shapes, which you're doing this week in the composition project. And color, texture, and value of the shapes always plays a key role. In the example on the right, this is very simple shapes, mostly ovals, a few longer curved rectangular shapes, but a lot of ovals. both in the design in the tablecloth and in the cut ends of the asparagus. This one is there's another great discussion in here. I'm going to talk to you about this one a little bit more in depth, where Julianne Opie used the very flat two-dimensional drawings on the wall to interact with Henry Moore's more abstract sculpture. And Julianne Moore is one of the artists who like to try to break down barriers between painting and drawing and sculpture and architecture. And the vinyl line drawings of pole dancers were placed to interact in a very witty dialogue with Henry Moore's abstracted figures. The positions of the drawings align the poles with the architectural grid of the ceiling. So if you look up, you can see that the beams coming across the ceiling line up with the poles. So it suggests that these are also holding up the building. And there's a really nice interplay of flat shapes and three-dimensional forms. So the sculpture has form and mass and volume, and these two-dimensional shapes are a nice contrast in sort of playing and interacting with those. Just remember that flat work can only be viewed from the front, but then when you see something that's three-dimensional artwork, you get to see it from different vantage points, and each view creates a different experience. Artists use naturalism and distortion, especially in advertising and in politics, as we see here. There are a lot of artists who work in realism. They create an image that is as close to life as possible. And if you did a Google search, you'd come up with some very famous artists that do very photorealistic painting. But then you have artists who intentionally distort, so they might exaggerate different features, as in this caricature of Bill Clinton. And this is often done if you want to provoke some kind of a response from the viewer, or it could be used to emphasize certain design elements. In this poster for Pulp Fiction, the artist has very cleverly used just a few shapes to create these very distinctive silhouettes of John Travolta and I can't remember his name, Samuel L. Jackson. How could I forget? But not only very few shapes, but also incorporated like shapes from the movie. So there, if you look closely, you start to see that there are gun shapes that define the nose, the bridge of the nose, and the eyebrow. And so this artist has very cleverly combined different elements from the film into this poster. You can use distortion to get across a point, as we discussed. You can also create what we call kitsch, which is, if you've, and I know you have, seen paintings or drawings of kittens and puppies with really huge eyes, or children with really huge eyes. Those are an overstatement of expression, and those are often referred to as kitsch. So naturalism tends to show nature and life as it is, and then idealism distorts art or distorts shapes to create the perfect or ideal form. And that's a recurrent theme that we see in art and society. We see it if we go and look at Greek and Roman statues. We see it in advertising, idealized versions of the human form, and it represents the world not as it really exists, but how the artist and or how society sees it as perfected. And then governments often use very idealized images to promote their propaganda. Here's a couple of examples. The artist on the left has painted herself in a very natural manner and not very flattering. The artist on the right has created an idealized form that's not based on anything, any model. Artists also abstract forms and shapes. So when you talk about abstraction, you might think of a simplification of a shape to the basic character of it. There's different degrees of abstraction. You can reduce a shape down to just the basic geometric shape, like a circle or a triangle or a rectangle, or you can have somewhere in between naturalism and abstraction. It's been used for centuries, and it still continues to be used as artists continue to show things in a new light. You don't have to rely on geometric shapes to have abstraction. Here we see one that is more biomorphic, so they're abstract shapes, but they kind of allude to organic forms. Like you might be able to see the shape of a foot or a flower or a leaf or something in these abstract shapes. Pure forms, pure circles, rectangles, triangles, are called non-objective shapes. And anything that is created with just these shapes is critiqued solely on the visual design. So if you were to critique this piece, you would talk about balance, you would talk about color, you would talk about pattern, things like that. It doesn't mean that it doesn't carry any emotional content, but it's much harder to apply, to critique that. So oftentimes you just stick to technical elements. Our book wants you to ask yourself, can any shape be truly non-objective? Because many shapes, even if they're abstract, can carry, will evoke a response or carry an emotional reference to the viewer. Shapes that are curvilinear are continual curved forms. We see them in still lifes. We see them in figure painting. We see them in Disney. Almost every Disney character is made up of curvilinear shapes. And they can exist alone, or they can exist with combinations of other shapes. On the opposite spectrum is rectilinear shapes, and these are forms that have straight lines, rectangular planes, and sharp edges. Whereas curvilinear shapes are organic and a little more friendly, rectilinear shapes often they give you the feeling of sharpness. They make you think of man-made or manufactured things. And then you can combine these, as in this delightful building in Prague. The roundness of the buildings, the end of the building, plays off all the rectangular windows, and that oddly shaped, off-balance shape on the left really adds an element of surprise. I can't wait to go to Prague and see this one day. We have to talk about positive and negative shapes, and it's related a little bit to figure and ground. So positive shapes are the main shape or subject in a picture, and the negative shapes is the space in which the positive shape is placed. So in this one, you have the woman is the figure or positive shape, and it's really clear the background is behind her. But you have to think about both. So not only do you, in the end, and when you're looking at work and when you're creating your own work, you're not only looking at the figure or the foreground, the positive shapes, but you have to consider the background or the negative shapes, because that will play into the way your composition is balanced or unbalanced, where the viewer's eye is going, all kinds of considerations. So this is a photograph, but it shows very clearly how negative shapes can become just as important as the positive shapes. So this is a letter R that's been photographed and turned on its side. And if we turn our heads, we can recognize it, but taken alone, it's, you know, a very interesting play of positive and negative space, both being equally interesting. Artists who work in sculpture think about negative space quite a bit, because as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, often you can walk around and you can see sculpture from many different angles and dimensions. So you have to consider the way that it's being viewed against the background. This is Richard Serra, and he makes these monumental sculptures, and he's always thinking about how the viewer is going to interact with the sky or the landscape behind his pieces. When you are compositing something like you're doing this week, you want to think about integration between positive and negative shapes. So if you place everything just randomly or even equally spaced, it sometimes doesn't look very planned. If things are very evenly spaced, they might look a little too boring. If they're too randomly placed, they just look like they were thrown on there. So, and that's sort of the example on the left. Some squares and rectangles are placed on a white background. But on the right-hand side, you see something that looks more, has more visual interest. It's more layered. It has more depth. It has more of a visual path because things are overlaid. There's some consideration about contrast and value and angles being put to use here. And it's far more engaging than the one on the left. These are how areas of positive and negative can play against each other to create an image. And there's actually 3 in the book showing different degrees of this positive and negative space. And so you can see on the left, there's a very clear, I always lose the words when I do this, demarcation between the negative space of the background and the figure or the foreground. But in the one on the right, those edges become blurred, especially on the left-hand side. And it is possible that you can combine positive and negative spaces so that they don't have much visual distinction. And in these types of ambiguous images, our minds become a little bit confused and we go back and forth between what we see. We either see the 2 men, one with a top hat, or we see the woman, or our brain just flips back and forth between those 2 things. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop